The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling campus of Westfield Maritime Academy as a sleek black sedan pulled through the ornate iron gates. Students hurrying to their first classes barely glanced at the vehicle, assuming it was just another parent dropping off their privileged child. They had no idea that the young woman stepping out of the back seat would turn their carefully constructed social hierarchy upside down within days. Sarah Chen adjusted her simple navy blazer and shouldered a worn leather messenger bag that had seen better days. At 19, she possessed an understated elegance that spoke of quiet confidence rather than desperate attention-seeking. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her shoes were sensible flats rather than the designer heels favored by most girls at this elite institution. Everything about her appearance suggested middle-class restraint, which was exactly the impression she intended to give. The Academy's admission office buzzed with activity as Sarah approached the reception desk. Mrs. Henderson, the silver-haired registrar who had been processing new students for over 2 decades, looked up with practiced politeness. "You must be Sarah Chen," she said, consulting her computer screen with slight confusion. "I have to admit, your paperwork is rather unusual. Most of our transfer students come with extensive documentation from previous institutions, but yours seems to have come through some sort of accelerated processing." Sarah smiled politely. "I understand there might be some irregularities. I've been studying abroad for several years, and international transcripts can be complicated to process." This was technically true, though studying aboard a naval vessel while serving as the youngest base admiral in maritime history wasn't quite the same as a semester in Paris. The carefully crafted cover story had been developed by military intelligence specifically for this mission, and every detail had been rehearsed until it became second nature. "Well, no matter," Henderson said, handing over a thick folder. "Your schedule, dormitory assignment, and orientation materials are all here. You'll be in Pemberton Hall, which houses our junior and senior students. Your roommate is Madison Wells, a lovely girl from one of our founding families." Sarah accepted the folder, noting the slight emphasis on founding families. Already the Academy's obsession with pedigree and social status was making itself known. In her previous life commanding a naval base with over 3,000 personnel, such petty concerns seemed almost quaint. To Pemberton Hall took her through the heart of campus, past manicured lawns where clusters of students lounged between classes. Sarah observed their interactions with the analytical mind that had served her well in military intelligence. The social groups were clearly defined, with invisible but rigid boundaries that determined who could sit where and speak to whom. At the center of the most prominent group sat a blonde girl who commanded attention without seeming to try. Her uniform was perfectly tailored, her hair styled with professional precision, and every gesture carried the casual arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. Other students orbited around her like planets around the sun, seeking approval with desperate eagerness. "That's Victoria Ashworth," said a voice behind Sarah. She turned to find a petite redhead with intelligent green eyes and a genuinely friendly smile. "I'm Emma Rodriguez, by the way." "You look new." "Sarah Chen," she replied, shaking Emma's offered hand. "And yes, I'm definitely new. Just transferred in." Emma glanced toward Victoria's group with barely concealed disdain. "Let me guess, Mrs. Henderson gave you the speech about founding families and tradition?" "Something like that. Victoria's family practically built this place," Emma explained as they walked. "Her great-grandfather was one of the original board members, and they've been major donors ever since. She's been Queen Bee since freshman year, and she doesn't take kindly to anyone who might threaten her position." Sarah studied Victoria more carefully, noting the way other students deferred to her, how conversations stopped when she approached, how even some teachers seemed to treat her with special consideration. In military terms, Victoria had established herself as the undisputed commander of this particular theater of operations. "What makes someone a threat to her?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the social dynamics. "Being prettier, smarter, or more interesting than her," Emma said with a laugh. Which honestly isn't that hard, but most people are too intimidated to try. "She has a way of making life very difficult for anyone who crosses her." They reached Pemberton Hall, an imposing brick building that managed to be both elegant and austere. The lobby was decorated with portraits of distinguished alumni and glass cases displaying various academic and athletic trophies. Sarah noted several maritime-themed awards, including one for excellence in naval studies, that made her suppress a smile. Room 314 was on the third floor, and Sarah knocked before using her key. The door swung open to reveal a spacious room with 2 beds, 2 desks, and large windows overlooking the campus quad. One side was already occupied, decorated with expensive furniture and designer accessories that probably cost more than most people's cars. "You must be my new roommate," said a perfectly modulated voice. Madison Wells emerged from what appeared to be a walk-in closet, dressed in a silk blouse and pearls that seemed excessive for a Tuesday morning. She was undeniably beautiful in the way that money could buy, with professionally straightened hair and makeup applied with museum-quality precision. "Sarah Chen," she said, setting down her bag on the unoccupied bed. "Nice to meet you." Madison looked her up and down with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating others based on their accessories and brands. Sarah could practically see her cataloging the worn messenger bag, the off-the-rack blazer, and the absence of any visible designer labels. "Where did you transfer from?" Madison asked, settling onto her bed with liquid grace. "I've been studying overseas for several years," Sarah replied, beginning to unpack her modest belongings. "My family moves around a lot for work." "How interesting," Madison said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "What does your father do?" "Government work," Sarah said truthfully. "Nothing too exciting." This was where the cover story became delicate. Admiral Chen's father was indeed a government employee, technically speaking, since his daughter held one of the highest positions in the naval command structure. But Madison's follow-up questions were clearly designed to place Sarah within the Academy's rigid social hierarchy, and there was no acceptable way to explain that her government work involved classified military operations. "Government work can be so varied," Madison said with practiced diplomacy. "Is he in administration or perhaps law?" "Something like that," Sarah said, deliberately keeping things vague. "He travels quite a bit, which is why I've been abroad." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Madison opened it to reveal 3 girls who could have stepped out of a fashion magazine, all perfectly groomed and radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. "Madison, darling," said the leader, a brunette with sharp features and calculating eyes. "We're heading to lunch. Aren't you going to introduce us to your new roommate?" "Of course," Madison said, though Sarah detected a note of reluctance. "This is Sarah Chen. She's transferred in from overseas." "Sarah, these are my friends, Jessica Hartwell, Chloe Patterson, and Brooke Sinclair." The 3 girls examined Sarah with the same appraising look Madison had used, clearly finding her wanting. Their smiles were polite but cold, the kind of courtesy extended to service staff or distant relatives who couldn't be completely ignored. "How lovely," Jessica said, her tone suggesting the opposite. "You'll have to tell us all about your previous school sometime. I'm sure it was quite different from Westfield." "I'm sure it was," Sarah agreed, amused by the transparent attempt to establish superiority. In her previous position, she had dealt with foreign diplomats, seasoned military officers, and heads of state who employed more subtle intimidation tactics. "We should let you get settled," Chloe added with false sweetness. "The social adjustment here can be quite challenging for some people." After they left, Sarah continued unpacking in silence. Her possessions were few but carefully chosen: some books, basic clothes, a laptop, and a small framed photograph that she placed on her nightstand. The photo showed a much younger Sarah, with her parents at her Naval Academy graduation, all 3 of them beaming with pride. To anyone who looked closely, it would be clear that this was no ordinary family snapshot. The rest of the day passed in a blur of orientation activities and introductory classes. Sarah moved through it all with quiet competence, observing everything while revealing nothing. Her professors were impressed by her knowledge and preparation, though they attributed it to excellent previous education rather than years of real-world experience in maritime operations. During lunch, she sat with Emma and a few other students who seemed to exist outside Victoria's sphere of influence. The conversation was refreshingly normal, covering everything from challenging coursework to weekend plans. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself almost relaxing, enjoying the simple pleasure of being around people her own age, without the weight of command responsibility. That peaceful interlude ended when Victoria Ashworth herself approached their table, flanked by Madison and her morning visitors. The cafeteria seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone sensed an important moment unfolding. "You must be the new transfer student," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent dining hall. "Sarah, isn't it?" "That's right," Sarah replied calmly, continuing to eat her sandwich without looking up. The casual dismissal clearly wasn't what Victoria had expected. She was accustomed to immediate attention and deference, and Sarah's failure to provide either created a palpable tension. "I hope you're settling in well," Victoria continued, her smile becoming more forced. "Westfield can be quite overwhelming for students who aren't used to our standards." "I'm managing fine, thank you," Sarah said, finally meeting Victoria's gaze with steady calm. There was something in Sarah's eyes that gave Victoria pause. Most students looked at her with either admiration or fear, but Sarah's expression held neither. Instead, there was a quality of assessment, as if she were evaluating Victoria rather than being evaluated by her. "That's wonderful," Victoria said after a moment, her voice carrying a slight edge. "I do hope you'll let us know if you need any help navigating the social aspects of academy life. Some people find it quite difficult to fit in here." The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, wrapped in concern and helpful advice. Sarah recognized it for what it was: a warning shot across the bow, establishing the territorial boundaries that new students were expected to respect. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said with equal politeness. "I'm sure I'll figure things out." Victoria's smile became razor sharp. "I'm certain you will. After all, everyone eventually finds their proper place here." With that pronouncement, she glided away, her entourage following like well-trained soldiers. The cafeteria gradually returned to normal volume, though Sarah noticed several students stealing glances in her direction. "Well," Emma said quietly, "that was interesting. Victoria doesn't usually bother with new students unless she sees them as either useful or threatening." "Which do you think I am?" Sarah asked. "Honestly, I'm not sure yet, but I have a feeling we're about to find out." That evening, Sarah sat at her desk working on assignments while Madison prepared for what she called an intimate gathering in Victoria's room. The process involved an hour of primping and multiple outfit changes, as if she were preparing for a state dinner rather than hanging out with friends. "You're welcome to join us if you'd like," Madison said, though her tone suggested the invitation was mere politeness. "Thanks, but I have a lot of catching up to do," Sarah replied, gesturing to her textbooks. "Of course," Madison said with barely concealed relief. "Well, don't wait up. These things can go quite late." After Madison left, Sarah found herself alone for the first time since arriving at the academy. She pulled out her secure communication device, a piece of equipment that looked like an ordinary smartphone but contained military-grade encryption technology. The device connected her to Admiral Harrison, her official superior, and one of only 3 people who knew her true identity and mission. His weathered face appeared on the small screen, looking tired but alert despite the late hour. "Admiral Chen," he said with a slight smile. "How are you finding civilian life?" "Interesting," Sarah replied. "The social dynamics here are more complex than I initially anticipated." "Having trouble with your cover?" "But I may have drawn some unwanted attention from the local power structure." Admiral Harrison's expression grew serious. "Remember, your mission is primarily intelligence gathering. We need to understand how these criminal networks are using elite educational institutions as recruitment grounds, but maintaining your cover is paramount." "Understood, sir. Though I have to say, the students here could benefit from some basic training in strategic thinking. Try not to reshape their entire social structure on your first week," Harrison said with dry humor. "Save some challenges for later." After ending the call, Sarah returned to her textbooks, but her mind kept drifting to the day's events. She had encountered hostile forces in international waters, negotiated with foreign governments, and commanded complex military operations. Yet somehow, navigating the social minefield of an elite academy seemed almost as challenging. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, one of the most powerful military officers of her generation, pretending to be an ordinary transfer student while a spoiled teenager attempted to establish dominance through designer clothes and social manipulation. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Emma holding 2 cups of hot chocolate and wearing pajamas decorated with cartoon anchors. "Thought you might want some company," Emma said with a grin. Madison's gatherings can last until dawn, and studying alone is depressing. "That's very kind," Sarah said, accepting the offered cup. "Though I have to ask, where did you get hot chocolate at this hour?" "I have a contraband hot pot in my room," Emma confessed. "Strictly against regulations, but sometimes you need real comfort food, not whatever they serve in the dining hall." They settled onto Sarah's bed, and Emma proved to be excellent company. She was studying marine biology, with hopes of working in conservation, and her passion for the subject was infectious. More importantly, she seemed genuinely kind, without the calculating edge that characterized most of Victoria's circle. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said after they'd been talking for an hour. "Of course. What were you really doing before you came here? And don't say studying abroad. I've met plenty of study abroad kids, and none of them had your kind of I don't know presence." Sarah considered her response carefully. Emma was perceptive, and maintaining her cover would require more subtle misdirection than she'd used with Madison. "My family moves around a lot," she said, which was true. "I've spent time in different environments, some of them pretty challenging. You learn to adapt." "Military family?" Emma guessed. "Something like that." Emma nodded, accepting the vague response. "That explains the posture and the way you handled Victoria today. Most people either grovel or run when she pulls that routine." "What did you think of my response?" "Honestly, I think you just painted a target on your back. Victoria doesn't like being ignored, and she really doesn't like being dismissed. She's going to make your life here very difficult unless you find a way to appease her." Sarah sipped her hot chocolate, considering this advice. In military terms, Victoria had established herself as the local commander, and Sarah's failure to acknowledge her authority would indeed be seen as insubordination requiring correction. "What would appeasement look like?" she asked. "Join her circle, follow her lead, make it clear that you're not a threat to her position. Basically, become another Madison." The thought was deeply unappealing. Sarah had spent years earning respect through competence and leadership, not social manipulation and designer accessories. The idea of playing submissive to a teenager's power games went against every instinct she possessed. "And if I don't?" Emma's expression grew serious. "Then you'd better be prepared for war. Victoria doesn't do subtle when her authority is challenged. She'll use every resource at her disposal to make you miserable until you either submit or leave." "What kind of resources are we talking about?" "Social isolation, academic sabotage, rumor campaigns, administrative complaints. She has friends in the faculty, connections with wealthy parents, and a network of students who'll do anything to stay in her good graces. She once destroyed a girl's entire senior year because she dated Victoria's ex-boyfriend." Sarah absorbed this information with growing fascination. Victoria's operation was more sophisticated than she'd initially realized, employing multiple pressure points and leveraging various power structures. It was actually quite impressive, in a twisted way. "You're thinking something," Emma observed. "I can see the wheels turning, just wondering what would happen if someone actually stood up to her." "Nobody's ever really tried," Emma admitted, "at least not successfully. A few people have attempted it over the years, but Victoria always comes out on top. She's been perfecting her system since freshman year." They talked for another hour before Emma returned to her room, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She stood at the window looking out over the darkened campus and considering her options. From a strategic standpoint, the smart move would be to avoid conflict and focus on her primary mission. Gathering intelligence on criminal recruitment networks didn't require her to revolutionize the academy's social structure. In fact, keeping a low profile would make her work significantly easier. But there was another consideration at play. Sarah had spent her entire adult life fighting for justice and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The idea of standing by while Victoria terrorized vulnerable students went against everything she believed in. Moreover, her mission might actually benefit from a higher profile within the student body. If criminal elements were indeed recruiting from elite institutions, they would likely target students with influence and connections. Remaining on the periphery might limit her access to the very network she needed to investigate. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that would have profound consequences for everyone at Westfield Maritime Academy. She wouldn't seek conflict with Victoria, but she also wouldn't back down if challenged. Let the chips fall where they may. Her last thought before falling asleep was a wry observation about the unexpected parallels between military command and high school politics. In both environments, respect had to be earned. Alliances were crucial, and showing weakness invited attack. The difference was that in her previous life, the stakes involved national security and international relations. Here, they apparently involved cafeteria seating arrangements and party invitations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Sarah Chen was ready to meet them head-on. The next morning brought Sarah's first real test at Westfield Maritime Academy, though it came from an unexpected direction. Dr. Marcus Webb's Advanced Naval Strategy class was known throughout the academy as one of the most challenging courses in the curriculum, designed to separate serious maritime students from those simply riding on family connections. Sarah entered the classroom to find 30 students arranged in a semicircle, all looking slightly nervous despite their expensive uniforms and confident facades. Dr. Webb himself was an imposing figure, a former Navy captain whose weathered hands and sharp eyes spoke of decades at sea. His reputation for intellectual rigor was matched only by his intolerance for privileged mediocrity. Today we'll be discussing the Battle of Jutland, Dr. Webb announced without preamble. I want analysis, not memorization. Who can tell me why Admiral Jellicoe's tactics were considered controversial? Several hands went up immediately, including Victoria's. Dr. Webb's gaze swept the room before settling on a nervous-looking boy near the front. Mr. Peterson? Peterson stammered. Admiral Jellicoe was criticized for being too cautious and not pursuing the German fleet more aggressively after the initial engagement, Webb said dismissively. Anyone else? Victoria raised her hand higher, clearly confident in her answer. She had spent considerable time preparing for this class, partly because naval history was genuinely interesting to her, but mostly because excelling in Dr. Webb's notoriously difficult course would further cement her academic reputation. Miss Ashworth? Admiral Jellicoe faced a strategic dilemma, Victoria began smoothly. The British Grand Fleet represented the cornerstone of British naval supremacy. Losing it would have meant losing the war, regardless of any tactical victories. His caution reflected the broader strategic reality that Britain had more to lose than to gain from a decisive engagement. Dr. Webb nodded approvingly. Better. You've identified the strategic context, but you're still missing the deeper tactical considerations. Anyone else care to elaborate? The room fell silent. Victoria's answer had been comprehensive and well-reasoned, covering the standard interpretation taught in most textbooks. Several other students had been prepared to offer similar responses, but Dr. Webb's dismissal suggested he wanted something more sophisticated. Sarah raised her hand. Miss Chen? Admiral Jellicoe's dilemma wasn't just strategic or tactical, Sarah said calmly. It was informational. The Grand Fleet had superior numbers and firepower, but the German High Seas Fleet had better intelligence gathering and communication systems. Jellicoe was essentially fighting blind, making decisions based on incomplete and often inaccurate information about enemy positions and intentions. The classroom was completely silent now. Webb leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Continue. The controversy over his caution misses the point, Sarah went on. In a complex operational environment with limited intelligence, aggressive pursuit could have led the Grand Fleet into prepared German positions or submarine ambushes. Jellicoe's restraint reflected sound operational security principles, not timidity. Dr. Webb studied her for a long moment. That's an unusually sophisticated analysis for someone your age, Miss Chen. Where did you encounter that interpretation? Sarah felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on her. She had drawn far more attention than intended, but retreating now would seem suspicious. I've always been interested in military history, she said truthfully. I've read extensively on naval warfare, including some primary source materials and contemporary military analyses, such as, "This was dangerous territory. Sarah's knowledge came from classified military briefings and strategic seminars attended by active naval officers. She needed to provide a credible source without revealing the true extent of her education. I had access to some academic papers through a university library where my father worked. She improvised. The analysis I mentioned comes from a modern strategic assessment that examined the battle through the lens of information warfare theory. It was plausible enough, and Dr. Webb seemed satisfied, but Sarah noticed Victoria staring at her with a mixture of surprise and calculation. Having her answer dismissed as superficial while a new student provided analysis that impressed Dr. Webb was clearly an unexpected development. The rest of the class proceeded without incident, but Sarah could feel the shift in dynamics. Several students who had barely noticed her the day before were now paying attention, while Victoria's circle seemed to be reassessing their initial dismissal of the quiet transfer student. After class, Sarah found herself walking alongside Dr. Webb as they headed toward the faculty building. "That was excellent work in there," he said. "I don't often encounter students with such a sophisticated understanding of operational complexity. Have you considered pursuing advanced study in military strategy?" "I'm still exploring my options," Sarah replied carefully, "but I've always found military leadership fascinating. I'd be happy to recommend some additional reading materials if you're interested. There are some classified case studies I could arrange access to, given your obvious aptitude and interest." Access to classified materials would provide perfect cover for her existing security clearance, while also potentially revealing information relevant to her mission. "I would be very interested in that," she said. "Excellent. Stop by my office tomorrow afternoon and we'll discuss it further." As Dr. Webb headed toward the faculty lounge, Sarah continued toward her next class, aware that she was being followed. She turned a corner and waited, unsurprised when Victoria appeared moments later with Madison and Jessica in tow. "That was quite a performance in Dr. Webb's class," Victoria said without preamble. Her tone was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in her posture. "I don't know what you mean," Sarah replied. "I just answered his question." "Of course you did," Victoria said with a thin smile. "I'm sure it was purely coincidental that you happened to have such detailed knowledge of a fairly obscure historical controversy." There was an accusation hidden in the polite words, though Sarah wasn't entirely sure what Victoria suspected. Did she think the display of knowledge was somehow staged? Or was she simply frustrated at being upstaged in front of a professor whose respect she valued? "I enjoy reading about military history," Sarah said simply. "It's a hobby of mine." "How interesting," Jessica interjected. "Most girls our age aren't particularly drawn to discussions of naval warfare." The implication was clear. Sarah's interests marked her as odd, potentially threatening to the carefully maintained social order where certain topics were deemed appropriate for discussion and others were not. "I suppose everyone has different interests," Sarah said mildly. "Indeed they do," Victoria said, her smile becoming more predatory. "Speaking of which, there's a small gathering this Friday evening in my room. Nothing formal, just a few friends getting together to discuss academic matters. You should join us." The invitation was delivered with the same tone Victoria might use to command a subordinate, and Sarah understood immediately that this wasn't a social courtesy. It was a summons, an opportunity for Victoria to establish dominance in a more controlled environment. "That sounds lovely," Sarah said, "but I'm afraid I have other plans that evening." The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Madison's eyes widened slightly. Jessica's mouth dropped open a fraction, and Victoria's smile froze in place. Clearly, declining Victoria's invitation simply wasn't done at Westfield Maritime Academy. "Other plans?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Personal study time," Sarah explained calmly. "I'm still catching up on some coursework from my previous school." It was a reasonable excuse, but everyone present understood that it was also a direct challenge to Victoria's authority. By prioritizing her academics over Victoria's social gathering, Sarah was essentially declaring that she didn't recognize Victoria's position in the academy hierarchy. "I see," Victoria said after a moment. "Well, perhaps another time. Though I should mention that these gatherings can be quite valuable for students who want to succeed here. We discuss more than just academics, if you understand my meaning." Now the threat was explicit. Victoria was offering inclusion in her inner circle, with all the social and academic benefits that entailed in exchange for acknowledgement of her superior status. Refusal would result in active opposition rather than mere indifference. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said, maintaining her calm demeanor. "But I'd prefer to focus on my studies for now." Your choice," Victoria said, though her tone suggested Sarah had made the wrong one. "I do hope you won't find the social aspects of academy life too challenging. Some students discover that academic success isn't enough to ensure a pleasant experience here." With that warning delivered, Victoria swept away, her entourage following like loyal courtiers. Sarah watched them go, recognizing that she had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The rest of the day confirmed her assessment. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the Academy's gossip networks, carried by students who had witnessed the exchange and embellished with each retelling. By afternoon, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how others treated her. Some students seemed intrigued by her willingness to stand up to Victoria, offering friendly smiles and small gestures of support. But others clearly viewed her as either dangerously naive or deliberately provocative, giving her wide berths in hallways and avoiding eye contact during shared classes. Emma found her in the library that evening, sliding into the chair across from Sarah's study Carol with obvious concern. "Are you completely insane?" she whispered urgently. "That's a fairly broad question," Sarah replied, not looking up from her textbook. "Could you be more specific?" "You turned down Victoria's invitation. In public, with witnesses. I had other plans." Emma stared at her in disbelief. "Sarah, I tried to warn you yesterday about what happens when people cross Victoria. She doesn't just get annoyed and move on. She systematically destroys anyone who challenges her authority. You make it sound like she runs a criminal organization rather than a social circle." "The distinction is smaller than you might think," Emma said grimly. "Students, faculty, administrators, even some board members. When she decides someone needs to be dealt with, she has resources most people can't imagine." Sarah finally looked up, studying Emma's genuinely worried expression. "What exactly are you expecting her to do?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. "That's what makes it scary. She's creative when it comes to making people's lives miserable. Academic sabotage, social isolation, administrative harassment. She once got a girl expelled by convincing the administration she was cheating, even though everyone knew Victoria had planted the evidence. This was disturbing information, suggesting that Victoria's influence extended well beyond normal student politics. If she truly had the ability to manipulate academic and disciplinary processes, then she represented a more serious threat than Sarah had initially assessed. "Why hasn't anyone reported her to higher authorities?" Sarah asked. Emma laughed bitterly. "To whom? Half the faculty thinks she's a model student, and the other half are too intimidated to cross her family's influence. The administration sees her as a valuable asset because of her family's donations, and other students are either part of her circle or too scared to speak up. That's a pretty comprehensive power structure," Sarah observed. "Exactly, which is why I'm begging you to reconsider your position before this escalates further. Apologize, ask for another invitation, make it clear you were just overwhelmed by the adjustment to a new school. Victoria might be willing to let this slide if you approach her correctly." Sarah appreciated Emma's concern, but the suggestion was impossible to accept. She had spent years in positions of genuine authority, making decisions that affected thousands of people and had real-world consequences. The idea of apologizing to a teenager for declining a social invitation was simply beyond her capacity. "I understand you're trying to help," Sarah said carefully, "but I can't do what you're suggesting. Is your pride really worth making your entire time here miserable?" It wasn't about pride, though Sarah couldn't explain that to Emma. Her mission at the academy required her to investigate criminal networks that might be recruiting from elite student populations. Dr. USAIC were so big that probably only DuckTales of his time. If Victoria's organization was as comprehensive and influential as Emma suggested, it might represent exactly the kind of structure Sarah was meant to identify. More importantly, everything she had learned about Victoria's methods suggested a pattern of intimidation and abuse that went well beyond normal teenage social dynamics. As a military officer, Sarah had sworn an oath to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. Standing by while Victoria terrorized vulnerable students would violate everything she believed in. "It's not about pride," Sarah said finally. It's about principle. Emma sighed deeply. Well, then, I hope your principles are worth what's coming, because Victoria's going to make this personal now and she doesn't lose gracefully. That evening, Sarah's secure communication device buzzed with an incoming message from Admiral Harrison. His face appeared on the encrypted screen, looking more concerned than she'd seen him since her arrival. "Admiral Chen," he said without preamble, "we've been monitoring local communications and your name has come up in some interesting contexts." "What kind of contexts, sir?" "Private phone conversations between several Academy board members and some very wealthy parents. Apparently, word has reached the upper levels of Academy leadership that a new student has been causing social disturbances." Sarah felt a chill of concern. If Victoria's influence extended to the board level, then her response to Sarah's defiance might be more serious than anyone had anticipated. "How serious is the threat to my cover?" she asked. "Unknown at this point, but we're seeing indications that certain parties want you investigated more thoroughly. Background checks, academic record verification, that sort of thing. My cover documentation should withstand standard scrutiny." "It should," Harrison agreed, "but if they push hard enough, or if they have access to government databases, things could get complicated. We may need to consider extracting you and approaching this from a different angle." The suggestion of extraction was deeply frustrating. Sarah had barely begun her mission, and the intelligence she was gathering about Victoria's network could prove valuable to understanding how criminal elements operated within elite institutions. "Request permission to continue the mission, sir. I believe I'm close to identifying the kind of power structure we're looking for." Harrison studied her carefully. "You think this Victoria Ashworth is connected to our targets?" "I think her organization demonstrates exactly the kind of influence and resource access that would make it attractive to criminal recruiters. Whether she's actively involved or just represents the type of student they'd target, either way she's relevant to our investigation. And if maintaining your cover requires you to submit to her authority?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I don't believe that's a viable option, sir. My background makes it impossible for me to convincingly play a submissive role, and any attempt to do so would likely raise more suspicions than it resolved." "Then you need to be prepared for escalation. If this girl has the kind of institutional support you're describing, she may be able to create serious problems for your mission. I'll proceed with caution but maintain my position." After ending the communication, Sarah sat in the darkness of her dormitory room, listening to Madison moving around on the other side of their shared space. Her roommate had been increasingly distant since the confrontation with Victoria, clearly choosing sides in what was shaping up to be a significant conflict. Through her window, Sarah could see lights in other dormitory buildings where students were studying, socializing, or preparing for the next day's challenges. For most of them, the biggest concerns were upcoming exams, weekend social plans, and maintaining their grades. They had no idea that their academy was potentially being used as a recruitment ground for criminal organizations, or that one of their classmates was actually a naval officer conducting an undercover investigation. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, one of the most powerful military officers of her generation, engaging in what amounted to high school drama because it served larger strategic purposes. The skills that had served her well in international negotiations and military operations were now being applied to cafeteria politics and dormitory social dynamics. But there was something else at play beyond her official mission. Every instinct she possessed as both an officer and a human being rebelled against Victoria's methods of control and intimidation. She had spent her career fighting bullies on a global scale, and she wasn't about to start accommodating them on a personal level. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Victoria began implementing whatever plan she had developed for dealing with Sarah's defiance. But Sarah had faced down hostile foreign navies, corrupt politicians, and international criminals. She was fairly confident she could handle one privileged teenager, regardless of her family connections and institutional influence. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the unexpected complexity of what should have been a straightforward intelligence-gathering mission. She had come to Westfield Maritime Academy expecting to investigate criminal recruitment networks operating within elite educational institutions. Instead, she found herself in the middle of a social war that might prove just as challenging as any military operation she had previously conducted. The difference was that in her previous assignments, the rules of engagement had been clearly defined, and she had possessed the full authority and resources of the naval command structure. Here, she was operating undercover with limited support. facing an adversary who understood the local terrain far better than she did. But Sarah Chen had not become the youngest base admiral in naval history by backing down from difficult challenges. If Victoria Ashworth wanted a war, she would get one. The question was whether either of them truly understood what they were starting. Victoria's response to Sarah's defiance came swiftly and from multiple directions, demonstrating the sophisticated nature of her influence network. The first sign appeared during Thursday morning's breakfast, when Sarah approached her usual table to find Emma sitting alone, looking uncomfortable. "Where is everyone?" Sarah asked, setting down her tray. Emma glanced around nervously before responding. "They found other places to sit. Apparently, there are concerns about being seen associating with certain people." The message was clear. Victoria had begun implementing social isolation protocols, pressuring other students to distance themselves from Sarah or face similar treatment. It was a classic power move, designed to demonstrate the consequences of defying established authority while offering a clear path back into good graces. "I see," Sarah said calmly, taking her seat and beginning to eat. "Any idea how widespread this campaign is?" "Pretty comprehensive," Emma admitted quietly. "I've been getting subtle suggestions all morning that I might want to reconsider my friendships. Nothing direct, just concerned advice from people who care about my social standing." "And yet you're still sitting here?" Emma smiled ruefully. "I've never been particularly good at following other people's rules, especially when they're obviously unfair. Besides, someone needs to warn you about what's coming next. There's more? Oh, there's definitely more. Madison mentioned that your academic records are being reviewed for irregularities. Apparently, some questions have been raised about your transfer credits and whether they meet academy standards. This was more serious than social pressure. If Victoria had convinced the administration to scrutinize Sarah's carefully constructed academic history, it could expose flaws in her cover story that might lead to deeper investigation. "What kind of irregularities?" Sarah asked. "Nothing specific yet, but the review process can be quite thorough. They'll want documentation for every course you've supposedly taken, verification from previous institutions, that sort of thing. It could take weeks to resolve, during which time your enrollment status might be in question." Sarah absorbed this information while maintaining her calm exterior. Her cover documentation was sophisticated, but it wasn't designed to withstand the kind of detailed scrutiny that a motivated administrator might apply. If Victoria had allies in the registrar's office or academic affairs department, they could potentially create problems that would be difficult to resolve without revealing her true identity. "There's something else," Emma continued. "I heard that Dr. Bessa Broach Webb received some interesting information about your background yesterday evening." "What kind of information?" "Someone suggested that your impressive display of knowledge in his class might have been the result of advanced preparation. That perhaps you had access to his lecture notes or exam questions before the class." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. This was a particularly clever attack, turning her legitimate expertise into evidence of academic dishonesty. If Dr. Webb began questioning the authenticity of her knowledge, it could undermine the relationship she had been building with him and potentially cost her access to the classified materials he had offered. "That's a serious accusation," she said. "It is. And unfortunately, it's the kind of thing that's very difficult to disprove. How do you demonstrate that your knowledge is genuine rather than the result of cheating?" It was an excellent question, and one that highlighted the sophisticated nature of Victoria's campaign. Rather than making direct accusations that could be easily refuted, she was planting seeds of doubt that would grow over time, creating an atmosphere of suspicion around everything Sarah did. The rest of breakfast passed in relative quiet, punctuated by the obvious avoidance of other students who would normally have joined them. Sarah noted which individuals seemed genuinely regretful about their behavior and which appeared to be actively cooperating with Victoria's isolation campaign. The information would be useful if the situation escalated further. After breakfast, Sarah made her way to Dr. Webb's office for their scheduled meeting about additional reading materials. She found him grading papers, his expression more reserved than it had been the previous day. "Miss Chen," he said, looking up as she knocked on his open door. "Come in. Though I have to admit, I've had some time to reconsider our conversation yesterday." "Oh?" Sarah kept her voice neutral, though she could see the direction this was heading. Your analysis of the Battle of Jutland was quite sophisticated. Dr. Curtin, Webb continued, setting aside his papers. Perhaps too sophisticated for someone your age, regardless of their background reading. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I mean that the interpretation you offered closely parallels some classified strategic assessments that aren't available to the general public. The kind of material that would only be accessible to active military personnel or individuals with high-level security clearances. Sarah felt a chill of concern. Dr. Pause. Webb's military background had given him access to exactly the kind of information that could expose her true identity if he pursued his suspicions far enough. I told you yesterday that I had access to academic papers through a university library, she said. Some of those papers may have referenced classified sources or been based on information that has since been declassified. Perhaps, Dr. Webb said, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. I've also heard some concerns about your academic preparation more generally. Questions about whether your transfer credits accurately represent the education you've actually received. So Victoria's campaign was already bearing fruit, turning Sarah's allies against her through careful manipulation of existing suspicions and concerns. I'm happy to provide any additional documentation the administration requires, Sarah said. Though, I have to say, these questions seem to have arisen quite suddenly. Academic integrity is taken very seriously here, Dr. Webb replied. When irregularities are brought to our attention, we have an obligation to investigate them thoroughly. Of course, though I hope any investigation will be based on facts rather than rumors or personal animosity. Dr. Webb's eyes sharpened at the implication. Are you suggesting that these concerns aren't legitimate? I'm suggesting that the timing seems convenient for certain parties who might prefer not to have their academic supremacy challenged by a new student. It was a calculated risk, directly implicating Victoria in the campaign against her. But Dr. Webb was intelligent enough to recognize political manipulation when he saw it, and Sarah hoped that appealing to his sense of fairness might counteract whatever pressure he was receiving. That's a serious allegation, he said after a moment. It's an observation based on the sequence of events. Yesterday, I offered an analysis that contradicted another student's response. Today, my academic credentials are suddenly under scrutiny. The correlation seems rather obvious. Webb studied her carefully, and Sarah could see him weighing various considerations. His military background would have given him experience with institutional politics and the ways that personal conflicts could masquerade as legitimate concerns. I'll take your comments under advisement, he said finally. In the meantime, I think it would be best to postpone our discussion of additional reading materials until these other matters are resolved. I understand, Sarah said, though the setback was frustrating. Her access to Dr. B's. Webb's materials could have provided valuable intelligence while also strengthening her cover story. However, Dr. Webb added as she prepared to leave, I will say that if someone were attempting to manipulate academic processes for personal reasons, I would find that very disturbing indeed. It was a small victory, but an important one. Dr. Webb might be proceeding cautiously, but he wasn't completely convinced by Victoria's campaign. With careful handling, he might yet become an ally rather than another obstacle. Sarah's next class was Advanced Maritime Law, taught by Professor Catherine Mills, a sharp-eyed woman whose legal background had made her one of the Academy's most respected instructors. Sarah entered the classroom to find the usual seating arrangement subtly altered, with empty chairs surrounding her normal spot, like a quarantine zone. The lesson covered international maritime jurisdiction, a subject that intersected directly with Sarah's actual experience in naval operations. She found herself torn between the desire to contribute meaningfully to the discussion and the need to avoid further demonstrating expertise that might seem suspicious. Professor Mills called on her twice during the session, asking for analysis of complex legal scenarios that would challenge even graduate students. Sarah provided thoughtful responses that drew on her genuine knowledge while being careful not to reveal information that could only have come from classified sources. After class, Professor Mills approached her with a concerned expression. Miss Chen, I wanted to speak with you about some questions that have been raised regarding your academic background. Sarah suppressed a sigh. Victoria's network was proving to be remarkably efficient at spreading doubt throughout the faculty. I'm aware that my transfer credits are being reviewed, Sarah said. Is there something specific about my performance in your class that concerns you? Quite the opposite, actually. Your understanding of international maritime law is exceptional. particularly in areas that typically require practical experience to fully comprehend. I'm wondering where you gained such sophisticated knowledge. This was a different angle than Dr. John Proof Webb had taken, focusing on Sarah's competence rather than questioning its authenticity. Professor Mills seemed genuinely curious rather than suspicious. My family traveled extensively when I was younger, Sarah said, sticking to her cover story. I was exposed to various legal systems and international boundary issues. Plus, I've always found law fascinating as an abstract intellectual challenge. Your analysis of territorial water disputes was particularly insightful. Have you considered law school? It's certainly an option, Sarah replied, though I'm still exploring different possibilities. Professor Mills nodded thoughtfully. Well, I hope these administrative questions get resolved quickly. Students with your level of preparation and analytical ability are rare, and it would be unfortunate if bureaucratic concerns interfered with your education. It was encouraging to have at least one faculty member who seemed supportive, though Sarah wondered how long that support would last if Victoria's pressure campaign intensified. The rest of the day brought further evidence of Victoria's systematic approach to isolation and intimidation. Sarah's lab partner in chemistry suddenly requested a change, citing scheduling conflicts that were obviously fabricated. Her study group for economics dissolved when its other members claimed they had formed a different group that was already full. Even the library staff seemed less friendly, responding to her requests with professional courtesy rather than the warmth they had previously shown. By dinner time, the transformation was complete. Sarah found herself eating alone while students who had been friendly just days before avoided eye contact and found reasons to sit elsewhere. The message was unmistakable: defy Victoria Ashworth, and this is what happens to you. Emma eventually joined her, though Sarah noticed that she glanced around nervously before sitting down. This is worse than I expected, Emma said quietly. Victoria's really pulled out all the stops. It's certainly comprehensive, Sarah agreed, though I have to admire the organizational efficiency. Coordinating this level of social pressure across multiple groups and institutions requires real leadership ability.
Emma stared at her in disbelief.
You're impressed by this? I'm impressed by the execution, not the purpose. Victoria has built something that's genuinely sophisticated in its scope and coordination. It's unfortunate that she's chosen to use it for petty tyranny rather than something constructive. Petty tyranny that's currently destroying your life at this academy. My life isn't destroyed, Sarah said calmly. It's just become more challenging. There's a difference. Sarah, you need to understand that this is only the beginning. Victoria's just getting started. If the social pressure and academic harassment don't work, she'll escalate to more serious measures. Such as? Emma looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard before answering. Disciplinary complaints, honor code violations, even criminal allegations if she thinks she can make them stick. I've seen her destroy people completely when they refuse to back down. Sarah absorbed this information while considering her options. Her mission required her to maintain her cover and continue gathering intelligence about potential criminal recruitment networks. Victoria's escalating campaign threatened both objectives, but backing down would eliminate any chance of understanding how power operated within elite institutions like Westfield. What happened to the others, she asked, the people who refused to back down? Most of them eventually left the academy, either through academic failure or disciplinary action. A few stuck it out but were completely marginalized for the rest of their time here. None of them ever really recovered their social standing or academic opportunities. And Victoria faced no consequences? None whatsoever. If anything, successfully breaking resistance only strengthened her position and made other students more afraid to challenge her. Sarah finished her dinner while contemplating the strategic situation. Victoria's power base was more extensive than she had initially realized, encompassing not just student social networks but also faculty relationships and administrative influence. Defeating such a comprehensive system would require more than simple resistance. It would need a coordinated campaign that exposed the corrupt foundations of Victoria's authority. The question was whether such a campaign was compatible with her primary mission, or would represent a dangerous distraction from her intelligence-gathering objectives. That evening, Sarah returned to her room to find Madison packing her belongings with obvious urgency. I've arranged to switch rooms, Madison announced without looking up. I'll be moving in with Jessica tomorrow morning. I see, Sarah said, setting down her books. May I ask why? Madison finally met her eyes, and Sarah was surprised to see genuine distress rather than mere social calculation. "Because I can't afford to be associated with you anymore," Madison said bluntly. "My family has significant business relationships with Victoria's family, and maintaining those connections is more important than roommate loyalty." It was brutally honest, and Sarah found herself respecting Madison's directness even while noting the implicit threat. "I understand," Sarah said, "though I hope you realize that yielding to this kind of pressure sets a dangerous precedent." "Maybe it does," Madison replied, continuing to pack. "But some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when you're guaranteed to lose. Victoria has resources and connections that you can't possibly match. Whatever point you're trying to make, it's not worth destroying your future over. And what if everyone took that approach? What would happen to people who couldn't protect themselves from Victoria's abuse?" Madison paused in her packing, clearly struggling with the moral implications of her decision. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I really am. But I have to think about my own survival here." After Madison left, Sarah sat alone in the suddenly spacious room, considering the events of the day. Victoria's campaign was proving to be even more effective than Emma had warned, systematically eliminating Sarah's social connections, academic opportunities, and even basic living arrangements. From a purely tactical standpoint, the smart move would be to find a way to defuse the situation before it escalated further. Victoria had demonstrated her power comprehensively, and continued resistance would likely result in even more serious consequences. But Sarah had not spent years fighting corruption and injustice on a global scale only to surrender to a privileged teenager's power games. More importantly, her investigation into criminal recruitment networks operating within elite institutions was beginning to reveal disturbing patterns that might extend far beyond Westfield Maritime Academy. Victoria's organization displayed characteristics that made it an ideal target for criminal infiltration: sophisticated coordination, extensive resource access, willingness to use intimidation and fraud, and complete insulation from accountability. Whether she was consciously involved with outside criminal elements or simply represented the kind of structure they would seek to exploit, her network deserved closer scrutiny. Sarah opened her secure communication device and composed a detailed report for Admiral Harrison, outlining the scope of Victoria's influence and the potential connections to their larger investigation. If she was going to continue this conflict, she needed to ensure that her superior officers understood both the risks and the potential intelligence value. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Victoria implemented the next phase of her campaign. But Sarah Chen had made her decision. She would not back down, regardless of the personal cost. If Victoria wanted a war, she would get one that would test the true limits of her power and influence. The question was whether either of them truly understood the forces they were about to unleash. Friday morning brought the most serious escalation yet in Victoria's campaign against Sarah. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the Academy's Dean of Students, summoned Sarah to her office with a formal written notice that cited urgent academic and behavioral concerns requiring immediate attention. Sarah arrived at the administration building to find a scene that had clearly been orchestrated for maximum intimidation. Dean Hawkins sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, flanked by the registrar, Mrs. Henderson, and Mr. James Crawford, the Academy's disciplinary officer. Victoria was nowhere to be seen, but her influence permeated the room like an invisible presence. "Miss Chen," Dean Hawkins began without preamble, "we've received several concerning reports about your conduct and academic preparation since your enrollment here. What specific concerns?" Sarah asked, maintaining her composed demeanor despite the formal atmosphere. "First, there are significant irregularities in your transfer documentation. Our registrar has been unable to verify several of the courses listed on your academic transcript, and the institutions you claim to have attended have no record of your enrollment." This was exactly what Sarah had feared. Victoria's pressure campaign had motivated the administration to dig deeper into her background than her cover story could withstand. The fictional study abroad programs and international schools that military intelligence had created would not survive detailed verification attempts.
"I've been studying through various international programs," Sarah said carefully.
"Some of them may not maintain records in formats that are easily accessible to American institutions. That's a possibility we considered," Mrs. Henderson interjected. However, when we contacted the European Maritime Institute that supposedly issued your advanced navigation certification, they had never heard of you. The course codes on your transcript don't match their current or historical curriculum. Sarah felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. Her cover story was unraveling faster than she could repair it, and the three administrators were clearly prepared for this meeting with documented evidence of the discrepancies. Moreover, Dean Hawkins continued, "We've received reports that your performance in several classes suggests knowledge and experience far beyond what would be expected from someone with your stated educational background. Some faculty members have expressed concerns about possible academic dishonesty, such as..." Mr. Crawford consulted his notes. Dr. Webb reported that your analysis of historical naval strategy contained information that closely paralleled classified military assessments. Professor Mills noted that your understanding of international maritime law suggested practical experience that would be unusual for a student your age. Other instructors have made similar observations. It was a clever trap. Sarah's genuine expertise, which she had tried to moderate but couldn't completely conceal, was being used as evidence against her. The very knowledge that made her qualified for this mission was now threatening to expose her. "I've always been an ambitious student," she said. "I read extensively and seek out challenging materials." "That's commendable," Dean Hawkins replied, "but it doesn't explain the specific discrepancies we've identified. We've also received reports of behavioral concerns that suggest difficulty adjusting to our academy community." Now they were getting to the heart of Victoria's campaign. The academic irregularities provided cover for what was essentially a disciplinary action based on Sarah's refusal to acknowledge Victoria's social authority. "What behavioral concerns?" Sarah asked. "Failure to integrate appropriately with your peer group, resistance to established social norms, and what some students have described as an unnecessarily confrontational attitude toward academy traditions." The language was carefully neutral, but Sarah recognized the underlying accusation. She was being punished for refusing to submit to Victoria's dominance, dressed up as concern for community harmony and institutional culture. "I was unaware that friendship choices and social preferences were subject to administrative oversight," Sarah said with deliberate mildness. "They're not," Dean Hawkins said sharply. "But when a student's behavior begins affecting the academic environment and community well-being, we have an obligation to intervene. Has my behavior affected the academic environment, or have other students chosen to alter their behavior in response to external pressure?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the administrators to acknowledge what everyone in the room understood but couldn't openly discuss. Victoria's campaign of social isolation and academic sabotage was the real cause of any disruption to community harmony. Mr. Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Miss Chen, we're not here to debate the motivations of other students. We're here to address serious concerns about your enrollment status and conduct." "What exactly are you proposing?" Dean Hawkins exchanged glances with her colleagues before responding. "Given the irregularities in your academic documentation and the adjustment difficulties you've experienced, we believe it would be in everyone's best interest if you took a voluntary leave of absence to resolve these issues." "A voluntary leave of absence," Sarah repeated. "And if I choose not to volunteer? Then we would be forced to initiate formal disciplinary proceedings that could result in involuntary suspension or expulsion," Dean Hawkins said. "The academic integrity concerns alone are sufficiently serious to warrant such action." It was a clear ultimatum. Leave quietly, or be forced out through a process that would create a permanent academic record of disciplinary action. Victoria had maneuvered the administration into doing her dirty work while maintaining plausible deniability about her own involvement. Sarah considered her options rapidly. Accepting the leave of absence would end her mission and potentially compromise the larger investigation into criminal recruitment networks. Fighting the charges would require resources and support that might expose her true identity. Either choice seemed to result in mission failure. "I'd like some time to consider your proposal," she said finally. "Of course," Dean Hawkins replied. "But we'll need your decision by Monday morning. In the meantime, you're restricted to campus pending resolution of these matters." Sarah left the administration building with her mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. Victoria's attack had been more sophisticated than she had anticipated, targeting the weakest points in her cover story, while maintaining legal and administrative legitimacy. Fighting back would require resources and tactics that went beyond normal student capabilities. She found Emma waiting anxiously in the library, clearly having heard about the morning's developments through the Academy's efficient gossip network. "How bad is it?" Emma asked immediately. "Bad enough," Sarah replied, settling into a chair beside her friend. "They want me to take a voluntary leave of absence to address irregularities in my academic background." Emma's face went pale. "Oh God, Sarah. I'm so sorry. I tried to warn you about how far Victoria would go, but I never imagined she'd be able to manipulate the administration this effectively." "That's not your fault," Sarah said, though she was still processing the full implications of Victoria's success. "You tried to help me understand the situation. What are you going to do?" That was the crucial question. So, Sarah's mission had always involved some risk of exposure, but she had expected that risk to come from criminal elements she was investigating, not from teenage social politics. Now she had to decide whether protecting her cover was worth abandoning the intelligence gathering that had brought her to Westfield in the first place. "I'm still evaluating my options," she said carefully. Emma studied her with growing concern. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Something I probably should have mentioned before, but I wasn't sure how relevant it was." "What is it?" Emma glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard before continuing in a low voice. "Victoria's influence doesn't just come from her family's wealth and social connections. There are rumors about other activities, things that go well beyond normal student politics." Sarah's interest sharpened immediately. "What kind of activities?" "I don't know the details, and most of it might just be speculation. But some people think Victoria's inner circle is involved in things that could get them expelled if the administration knew about them. Academic fraud, identity theft, even connections to criminal organizations outside the academy." This was exactly the kind of intelligence Sarah had come to Westfield to investigate. If Victoria's network was indeed connected to criminal elements, then fighting her wasn't just a matter of personal principle, it was central to Sarah's mission. "What makes people think there are criminal connections?" she asked. "Money, mostly. Victoria and her friends always seem to have access to resources that go way beyond their family allowances. Expensive trips, designer clothes, electronic equipment, and they're very secretive about certain activities and relationships." "Has anyone ever tried to investigate these rumors?" Emma laughed bitterly. "Who would investigate? The administration sees Victoria as a model student. The faculty thinks she's academically gifted, and other students are too scared to ask questions. Besides, even if the rumors are true, Victoria's family has enough influence to make problems disappear." Sarah absorbed this information while reconsidering her entire assessment of the situation. What she had initially viewed as an unfortunate distraction from her real mission might actually be the mission itself. If Victoria's organization was connected to the criminal networks that military intelligence suspected of recruiting from elite institutions, then exposing her could provide exactly the intelligence breakthrough that justified Sarah's presence at Westfield. "Emma," she said carefully, "hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to investigate these rumors more seriously, how would they go about it?" "You're not seriously considering that, are you?" Emma asked with obvious alarm. "I'm considering all my options. Sarah, even if the rumors are true, trying to expose Victoria would be incredibly dangerous. She has resources and connections that could make your current problems seem minor by comparison. But if she's actually involved in criminal activity, shouldn't someone be working to stop her?" Emma stared at her for a long moment. "Who are you, really?" Because normal transfer students don't talk about investigating criminal organizations or standing up to someone with Victoria's power base. Most people in your situation would be focused on salvaging their academic career, not planning counterattacks. The question was uncomfortably perceptive, and Sarah realized that her military background was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Her approach to problems, her analytical thinking, and her refusal to be intimidated all pointed to experiences that went well beyond normal civilian education. "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies," she said finally, "and who believes that people with power have a responsibility to use it ethically." "That's admirable in principle," Emma replied, "but principles don't protect you from expulsion, criminal charges, or worse. Victoria has demonstrated that she can manipulate the entire institutional structure of this academy. What makes you think you can fight that with moral conviction alone?" It was an excellent question. and one that Sarah couldn't answer honestly without revealing her true identity and mission. Her confidence came from years of military training, access to intelligence resources, and the backing of the naval command structure, none of which she could explain to Emma. "Maybe I can't," Sarah admitted, "but I have to try." That afternoon, Sarah used her secure communication device to contact Admiral Harrison with an urgent status update. His face appeared on the encrypted screen, looking more concerned than she had ever seen him. "Admiral Chen," he said immediately, "we've been monitoring communications related to your situation. It appears that your cover may be more compromised than we initially realized." "How so, sir?" "We've detected inquiries from several sources attempting to verify your background through channels that could eventually lead to classified databases. If they persist, maintaining your cover will become impossible." Sarah felt a chill of concern. "Are these inquiries coming from the Academy administration, but others appear to originate from private investigation firms with connections to criminal organizations? Someone with significant resources is very interested in learning who you really are." This confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that Victoria's network had connections that extended well beyond normal student politics. The level of investigation being directed at her background suggested resources and capabilities that no teenager should possess. "Sir, I believe we may have stumbled onto exactly the kind of criminal recruitment network we were sent to investigate. Victoria Ashworth's organization displays characteristics that make it an ideal target for criminal infiltration. And now we have evidence that sophisticated investigation resources are being directed against me." Admiral Harrison considered this assessment carefully. "That's possible, but it also means your position is becoming untenable. If criminal elements are involved, they may have access to intelligence-gathering capabilities that could expose your identity despite our cover preparations. Request permission to shift from passive intelligence gathering to active investigation, sir. If Victoria's network is connected to criminal organizations, we need to understand the scope and nature of those connections. That's a significant escalation in mission parameters. Are you confident you can maintain operational security while conducting active investigation?" Sarah considered the question honestly. Her position at the academy was already compromised, and further attempts to maintain her cover as a normal student would likely fail regardless of what action she took. At this point, aggressive investigation might be her best chance of gathering valuable intelligence before the situation forced extraction. "I believe active investigation may be our only remaining option, sir. My cover is degrading rapidly, and we may lose this opportunity if we don't move quickly." "Understood. You're authorized to proceed with active investigation, but with extreme caution. We'll prepare extraction protocols in case the situation becomes unsalvageable." After ending the communication, Sarah sat in her empty dormitory room considering the new phase of her mission. What had begun as a simple intelligence-gathering assignment had evolved into something much more complex and dangerous. But for the first time since arriving at Westfield, she felt like she was moving toward her actual objectives rather than simply reacting to threats. That evening, she began implementing a plan that would either expose the criminal connections she suspected or result in her complete exposure and mission failure. Either way, the conflict with Victoria Ashworth was about to reach a decisive phase. The question was whether Sarah could uncover the truth before Victoria's resources and connections made further investigation impossible. Time was running short, and the stakes were higher than anyone at Westfield Maritime Academy could possibly imagine. Saturday night brought the confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone involved, though it began in the most unlikely way possible. Sarah was reviewing intelligence files on her secure device when a soft knock interrupted her concentration. She opened the door to find Victoria Ashworth standing alone in the hallway, looking surprisingly vulnerable without her usual entourage. "We need to talk," Victoria said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed. "May I come in?" Sarah stepped aside, allowing Victoria to enter the room that Madison had vacated just days earlier. Victoria moved with uncharacteristic hesitation, her usual commanding presence replaced by something that resembled genuine nervousness. "This is unexpected," Sarah said, closing the door behind her unwelcome visitor. "I imagine it is," Victoria replied, settling onto Madison's abandoned bed with careful grace. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here instead of celebrating your upcoming departure from the academy?" The thought had occurred to me. Victoria studied Sarah's face with an intensity that seemed to be looking for something specific. When she spoke again, her voice carried none of its usual theatrical authority. "Tell me something, Sarah Chen. What exactly are you?" The question was so direct that it caught Sarah off guard. Victoria's tone suggested that she already suspected the answer, which created a dangerous new dynamic in their conflict. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah replied carefully. "I mean that nobody responds to systematic intimidation and institutional pressure the way you have, unless they possess resources and experience that go well beyond normal student capabilities. I've broken dozens of people using the same methods I've used on you, but you've barely flinched." Victoria stood and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened campus with an expression Sarah couldn't read. "More importantly," Victoria continued, "the investigation into your background has revealed some very interesting inconsistencies. Inconsistencies that suggest your identity here might not be entirely genuine." Sarah felt a chill of concern but maintained her composed exterior. "I think you're overestimating the sophistication of your intelligence gathering." Victoria turned back to face her with a smile that contained no warmth. "Am I? Because the private investigators my family employs have been unable to verify significant portions of your supposed academic history. The international schools you claim to have attended, the study abroad programs that supposedly prepared you so well, none of them have any record of your existence." This was worse than Sarah had anticipated. Victoria's family apparently had access to investigation resources sophisticated enough to uncover flaws in military-grade cover documentation. "More interesting still," Victoria continued, "when these investigators attempted to dig deeper into your background, they encountered security barriers that shouldn't exist for a normal civilian student. Database lockouts, classified information protocols, the kind of protection that's reserved for people with very special circumstances." Sarah realized that her worst fears were being confirmed. Victoria's investigation had pushed hard enough against her cover story to trigger the security protocols that protected her true identity, which meant that anyone with sufficient resources and determination could potentially discover that she was far more than she appeared to be. "I have to admit," Victoria said, settling back onto the bed, "when I first realized you might not be who you claimed to be, I was primarily concerned about the threat you represented to my position here. But the more I've learned, the more fascinating this situation has become." "Fascinating how?" "Because I think I know what you really are, Sarah Chen, and if I'm right, then we may have more in common than either of us initially realized." Victoria reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a tablet device that she activated with her fingerprint. The screen displayed what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence dossier, complete with photographs, documentation, and analysis that went well beyond anything a civilian should have access to. "Admiral Sarah Chen," Victoria read from the screen. "Age 19, youngest base admiral in United States naval history. Currently on classified assignment investigating criminal recruitment networks operating within elite educational institutions." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the full scope of Victoria's intelligence capabilities. Not only had her cover been completely penetrated, but Victoria apparently had access to classified military information that should have been impossible for a civilian to obtain. "How did you get that information?" Sarah asked, abandoning any pretense of maintaining her cover story. "The same way I get most information that I need," Victoria replied with a satisfied smile. "Through